to story time. If you have not gotten caught up on this book yet, I recommend watching the first few. Watch the ones. Get caught up. Start with part one, work your way up yonder. You know the drill. Because we're like halfway through the book, and at this point, it won't make much sense to you if you start here. So, yes. Let's see. Where were we? He'd found that even the people whose job of work was, so to speak, the universe, didn't really believe in it, and were actually quite proud of not knowing what it really was, or even if it could theoretically exist. To Newt's straightforward mind, this was intolerable. Newt had not believed in the Cub Scouts, and then, when he was old enough, not in the Scouts either. He was prepared to believe, though, that the job wages clerk at United Holdings PLC, was possibly the most boring in the world. This is how Newton Pulsifer looked as a man. If he went into a phone booth and changed, he might manage to come out looking like Clark Kent. But he found he rather liked Shadwell. People often did, much to Shadwell's annoyance. The Rajites liked him because he always eventually paid his rent and didn't cause any trouble, and was racist in such a glowering, undirected way that it was quite inoffensive. It was simply that Shadwell hated everyone in the world, regardless of caste, color, or creed, and wasn't going to make any exceptions for anyone. Madame Tracy liked him. Newt had been amazed to find that the tenant of the other flat was a middle-aged, motherly soul whose gentlemen callers called as much for a cup of tea and a nice chat as for what little discipline she was still able to exact. Sometimes, when he nursed a half pint of Guinness on a Saturday night, Shadwell would stand in the corridor between their rooms and shout things like, "Whore of Babylon!" But she told Newt privately that she'd always felt rather gratified about this, even though the closest she'd been to Babylon was Torremolinos. It was like free advertising, she said. She said she didn't mind him banging on the wall and swearing during her seance afternoons either. Her niece had been giving her a jip, and she wasn't always up to operating the table wrapper, she said, so a bit of muffled thumping came in useful. On Sundays, she'd leave him a bit of dinner on his doorstep with another plate over top of it to keep it warm. You couldn't help liking Shadwell, she said. For all the good it did, though, she might as well be flicking bread pellets into a black hole. Newt remembered the other cuttings. He pushed them across the stained desk. "What are these?" said Shadwell suspiciously. "Phenomena," said Newt. "You said to look for phenomena. There's more phenomena than witches these days, I'm afraid. Anyone been shooting hares with a silver bullet, and next day old crone in the village is walking with a limp?" Shadwell said hopefully. "I'm afraid not. Any cows dropping dead after some woman has looked at 'em?" "No." "What is it then?" said Shadwell. He shuffled across to the sticky brown cupboard and pulled out a tin of condensed milk. "Odd things happening," said Newt. He'd spent weeks on this. Shadwell had really let the papers pile up. Some of them went back for years. Newt had quite a good memory. Perhaps because in his 23 years, very little had happened to fill it up, and he had become quite expert on some very esoteric subjects. "Seems to be something new every day," said Newt, flicking through the rectangles of the newsprint. "Something weird has been happening to nuclear power stations. No one seems to know what it is, and some people are claiming that the lost continent of Atlantis has risen." He looked proud of his effort. Shadwell's penknife punctured the condensed milk tin. There was a distant sound of a telephone ringing. Both men instinctively ignored it. All the calls were for Madame Tracy anyway, and some of them were not intended for the ear of man. Newt had conscientiously answered the phone on his first day, listened carefully to the question, and said, "Marks and Spencer's, 100% cotton, Y fronts actually," and had been left with a dead receiver. Shadwell sucked deeply. "Ach, that's no proper phenomena," he said. "I can't see any witches doing that. They're more for the sinking old things, ye ken." Newt's mouth opened and shut for a few times. "If we're strong in a fight against witchery, we can't afford to be sidetracked by this style of thing," Shadwell went on. "Haven't ye got anything more witchcrafty? But American troops have landed on it to protect it from things," moaned Newt. "A non-existent continent." "Any witches on it?" said Shadwell, showing a spark of interest for the first time. "It doesn't say," said Newt. "Ah, then it's just politics and geography," said Shadwell dismissively. Madame Tracy poked her head around the door. "Cooey, Mr. Shadwell," she said, giving Newt a friendly little wave. "A gentleman on the telephone for you." "Hello, Mr. Newton." "Ah, well, you harlot," said Shadwell automatically. "He sounds ever so refined," said Madame Tracy, taking no notice. "And I'll be getting us a nice bit of liver for Sunday." "I'd sooner sup with the devil, woman." "So if you'd let me have the plates back from last week, it'd be a help. There's a love," said Madame Tracy, and tottered unsteadily back on 3-inch heels to her flat, and whatever it was that had been interrupted. Newt looked despondently at his cuttings as Shadwell went out grumbling on the phone. There was one about the stones of Stonehenge moving out of position, as though they were iron filings in a magnetic field. He was vaguely aware of one side of a telephone conversation. "Who? Ah, aye, ye say. What class of thing would that be?" "Aye, just as you say, sir." "And where's this place, then?" But mysteriously, moving stones wasn't Shadwell's cup of tea, or rather tin of milk. Fine, Shadwell reassured the caller. "We'll get on to it right away. I'll put my best squad on it and report success to you any minute, I have no doubt. Goodbye to you, sir. And bless you too, sir." There was the ting of a receiver going back on the hook, and then Shadwell's voice, no longer metaphorically crouched in deference, said, "Dear boy, ye great southern pansy." He shuffled back into the room and then stared at Newt as if he had forgotten why he was there. "What was it you was going on about?" he said. "All these things that are happening," Newt began. "Aye," Shadwell continued to look through him, while thoughtfully tapping the empty tin against his teeth. "Well, there's this little town which has been having some amazing weather for the last few years," Newt went on helplessly. "What, raining frogs and similar?" said Shadwell, brightening up a bit. "No, it just has normal weather for the first time of year. Or for the time of year, sorry." "Call that a phenomena?" said Shadwell. "I've seen phenomenas that'd make your hair curl, laddie." He started tapping again. "When do you remember normal weather for the time of the year?" said Newt, slightly annoyed. "Normal weather for the time of the year is not normal, Sergeant. It has snow at Christmas, When did you last see snow at Christmas? And long hot Augusts every year, and crisp autumns? The kind of weather you used to dream of as a kid. It never rained on November the 5th, and always snowed on Christmas Eve. Shadwell's eyes looked unfocused. He paused with the condensed milk tin halfway to his lips. I never used to dream when I was a kid, he said quietly. Newt was aware of skidding around the lip of some deep, unpleasant pit. He mentally backed away. It's just very odd, he said. There's a weatherman here talking about averages and norms and microclimates and things like that. What's that mean? Said Shadwell. Means he doesn't know why, said Newt, who hadn't spent years on the literal of business without picking up a thing or two. He looked sidelong at the Witchfinder Sergeant. Witches are well known for affecting the weather, he prompted. I looked it up in the Discovery. Oh, God, he thought, or other suitable entity. Don't let me spend another evening cutting newspapers to bits in this ashtray of a room. Let me get out in the fresh air. Let me do whatever is the WA's equivalent of going water skiing in Germany. It's only 40 miles away, he said tentatively. I thought I could just sort of nip over there tomorrow and have a look around, you know. I'll pay my own petrol, he added. Shadwell wiped his upper lip thoughtfully. This place, he said, it wouldn't be called Tadfield, would it? That's right, Mr. Shadwell, said Newt. How did you know that? Wonder what the Southerners is playing at, no, said Shadwell under his breath. Well, he said out loud, and why not? Who will be playing Sergeant? Who will be playing Sergeant? Said Newt. Shadwell ignored him. I suppose it can't do any harm. You'll pay your own petrol, you say? Newt nodded. Then you'll come here at 9 o'clock in the morning, he said, afore you go. What for? Said Newt. Your armor of righteousness. Just after Newt had left, the phone rang again. This time it was Crowley, who gave approximately the same instructions as Aziraphale. Shadwell took them down again for form's sake, while Madame Tracy hovered delightedly behind him. 2 calls in one day, Mr. Shadwell, she said. Your little army must be marching away like anything. Ah, away with you murrin plashed bearzine. It's not English, whatever this is, muttered Shadwell and slammed the door. Tadfield, he thought, well, so long as they paid up on time. Neither Aziraphale nor Crowley ran the Witchfinder army, but they both approved of it, or at least knew that it would be approved of by their superiors, so it appeared on the list of Aziraphale's agencies, because it was, well, a Witchfinder army. And you had to support anyone calling themselves Witchfinders in the same way that the USA had to support anyone calling themselves anti-communists. And it appeared on Crowley's list for the slightly more sophisticated reason that people like Shadwell did the cause of hell no harm at all. Quite the reverse it was felt. Strictly speaking, Shadwell didn't run the WA either. According to Shadwell's pay ledgers, it was run by Witchfinder General Smith. Under him were Witchfinder Colonels Green and Jones, and Witchfinder Majors Jackson, Robinson, and Smith, no relation. And then there were Witchfinder Majors Saucepan, Tin, Milk, and Cupboard, because Shadwell's limited imagination had been beginning to struggle at this point, and Witchfinder Captain Smith, and ditto, and 500 Witchfinder privates and corporals and sergeants. Many of them were called Smith, but this didn't matter because neither Crowley nor Aziraphale had ever bothered to read that far. They simply handed over the pay. After all, both lots put together only came to around €60 a year. Shadwell didn't consider this in any way criminal. The army was a sacred trust, and a man had to do something. The old ninepences were... Ninepences? Is that the right? Okay, whatever. Weren't coming in like they used to. Saturday. Dun, 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 dun. We get closer to the end of the world. It was very early on Saturday morning, on the last day of the world, and the sky was redder than blood. The International Express delivery man rounded the corner at a careful 35 miles an hour, shifted down to second, and pulled up on the grass verge. He got out of the van and immediately threw himself into a ditch to avoid an oncoming lorry that had barreled around the bend at something well in excess of 80 miles an hour. He got up, picked up his glasses, put them back on, retrieved his parcel and clipboard, brushed the grass and mud from his uniform, and as an afterthought, shook his fist at the rapidly diminishing lorry. Shouldn't be allowed, bloody lorries, no respect for all the road users. What I always say is remember that without a car, son, you're just a pedestrian too. He climbed down the grassy verge, clambered over a low fence, and found himself beside the river Uck. The International Express delivery man walked along the banks of the river, holding the parcel. Farther down the riverbank sat a young man dressed in all white. He was the only person in sight. His hair was white, his skin chalk pale, and he sat and stared up and down the river as if he were admiring the view. He looked like how Victorian romantic poets looked just before the consumption and drug abuse really started to cut it. The International Expressman couldn't understand it. I mean, in the old days, and it wasn't that long ago really, there had been an angler every dozen yards along the bank. Children had played there, courting couples had come to listen to the splish and gurgle of the river, and to hold hands and to get all lovey-dovey in the Sussex sunset. He'd done that with Maud, his missus, before they were married. They'd come here to spoon, and on one memorable occasion, fork. Times changed, reflected the delivery man. Now white and brown sculptures of foam and sludge drifted serenely down the river, often covering it for yards at a stretch, and where the surface of the water was visible, it was covered with molecules thin petrochemical sheen. There was a loud whirring as a couple of geese, thankful to be back in England again after a long, exhausting flight across the North Atlantic, landed on a rainbow-slicked water and sank without a trace. Funny old world, thought the delivery man. There's the Uck. It used to be the prettiest river in this part of the world, and now it's just a glorified industrial sewer. The swans stink to the bottom, and the fishes float on top. Well, that's progress for you. You can't stop progress. He had reached the man in white. Excuse me, sir, party name of Chalky? The man in white nodded and said nothing. He continued to gaze out at the river, following an impressive sludge and foam sculpture with his eyes. So beautiful, he whispered. It's all so damn beautiful. The delivery man found himself temporarily devoid of words. Then his automatic systems cut in. Funny old world, isn't it? And no mistake, I mean. You go all over the world delivering, and then here you are, practically in your own home, so to speak. I mean, I was born and bred around here. And I've been to the Mediterranean and to Des Moines, and that's in America, sir. And now here I am, and here's your parcel, sir. Party name of Chalky took the parcel and took the clipboard and signed for the parcel. The pen developed a leak as he did so. and his signature obliterated itself as it was written. It was a long word, and it began with a P. Pestilence. And then there was a splotch, and then it ended in something that might have been ents and might have been ocean. Pollution, pestilence, same guy. We're talking about the four horsemen here. Much obliged, sir, said the delivery man. He walked back along the river, back toward the busy road where he had left his van, trying not to look at the river as he went. Behind him, the man in white opened the parcel, and it was a crown, a circlet of white metal set with diamonds. He gazed at it for some seconds with satisfaction, then put it on. It glinted in the light of the rising sun. Then the tarnish, which had begun to suffuse its silver surface when his fingers touched it, spread to cover it completely, and the crown went black. White stood up. There's one thing you can say for air pollution. You get utterly amazing sun rays. It looked like someone had set fire to the sky, and a careless match would have set fire to the river. But alas, there was no time for that now. In his mind, he knew where the four of them would be meeting, and he was going to have to hurry to be there by this afternoon. Perhaps we will set fire to the sky, he thought, and he left that place almost imperceptibly. It was nearly time. The delivery man had left his van on the grass verge by the dual carriageway. He walked around to the driver's side carefully because other cars and lorries were still rocketing around the bend, reached in through the open window and took the schedule from the dashboard. Only one more delivery to make then. He read the instructions on the delivery voucher carefully. He read them again, paying particular attention to the address in the message. The address was one word: everywhere. Then, with his leaking pen, he wrote a brief note to Maud, his wife. It simply read, "I love you." Then he put the schedule back on the dashboard, looked left, looked right, looked left again, and began to walk purposefully across the road. He was halfway across when a German juggernaut came around the corner. Its driver, crazed on caffeine, little white pills, and EEC transport regulations. He watched its receding bolt. Core, he thought. That one nearly had me. And then he looked down at the gutter. Oh, he thought. Yes, agreed a voice from behind his left shoulder, or at least from behind the memory of his left shoulder. The delivery man turned and looked and saw. At first, he couldn't find the words, couldn't find anything. And then the habits of a working lifetime took over, and he said, "Message for you, sir." "For me?" "Yes, sir." He wished he'd still had a throat. He could have swallowed if he still had a throat. "No package, I'm afraid, sir. It's a message." "Deliver it, then." "It's this, sir. Ahem. Come and see." Finally, there was a grin on its face, but then, given the face, there couldn't have been anything else. "Thank you," it continued. "I must commend your devotion to duty." "Sir?" The late delivery man was falling through gray mist, and all he could see were two spots of blue that might have been eyes and might have been distant stars. "Don't think of it as dying," said Death. "Just think of it as leaving early to avoid the rush." The delivery man had a brief moment to wonder whether his new companion was making a joke, and to decide that he wasn't, and then there was nothing. Red sky in the morning. It was going to rain. Yes. Witchfinder Sergeant Shadwell stood back with his head on one side. "Right then," he said. "You're all ready to go. Have you got it all? Yes, sir. Pendulum of discovery? Pendulum of discovery, yes. Thumbscrew? Newt swallowed and patted a pocket. Thumbscrew. Newt swallowed. Firelighters? I really think, Sergeant, that Firelighters? Firelighters, said Newt sadly, and matches. Bell, book, and candle? Newt patted another pocket. It contained a paper bag, inside which was a small bell of the sort that maddens budgergers. That's a word. A pink candle of the birthday cake persuasion, and a tiny book called Prayers for Little Hands. Shadwell had impressed upon him that although witches were the primary target, a good witch finder should never pass up the chance to do a quick exorcism, and should have his field kit with him at all times. Bell, book, and candle, said Newt. Pin? Pin. Good lad, never forget your pin. It's the bayonet and your artillery alight. It's kind of funny because exorcisms are kind of like witchcraft themselves. Just saying. A little interlude there. Shadwell stood back. Newt noticed with amazement that the old man's eyes had misted over. I wish I was going with you, he said. Of course, this won't be anything, but it'd be good to get out and about again. It's a trying life, you can. All this lying in the wet bracken, spying on their devilish dancing. It gets into your bones, something cruel. He straightened up and saluted. Off you go then, Private Pulsifer. May the armies of glorification march with you. After Newt had driven off, Shadwell thought of something that he'd never had the chance to do before. What he needed now was a pin. No, a military-issue pin, which is for the use of just an ordinary pin, such as you might stick in a map. The map was on the wall. It was old. It didn't show Milton Keynes. It didn't show Harlow. It barely showed Manchester and Birmingham. It had been the Army's HQ map for 300 years. There were a few pins in it still, mainly in Yorkshire, Lancashire, and a few in Essex. But they were almost rusted through. Elsewhere, mere brown stubs indicated the distant mission of a long-ago witch-finder. Shadwell finally found a pin among the debris in an ashtray. He breathed on it, polished it to a shine, squinted at the map until he located Tadfield. Triumphantly, rammed the pin home. It gleamed. Shadwell took a step backwards and saluted again. There were tears in his eyes. Then he did a smart about turn and saluted the display cabinet. It was old and battered and the glass was broken, but in a way it was the W.A. It contained the regimental silver, the inter-battalion golf trophy, not competed for, alas, in 70 years. It contained the patent muzzle-loading thundergun of Witchfinder Colonel. Ye shall not eat any living thing with blood, neither shall ye use enchantment nor observe times. Dalrymple. It contained a display of what were apparently walnuts, but were in reality a collection of shrunken headhunters' heads, donated by Witchfinder C.S.M. Horace. Get them before they get you, narker who traveled widely in foreign parts. It contained memories. Shadwell blew his nose noisily on his sleeve. And then he opened a tin of condensed milk for breakfast. If the armies of glorification had tried to march with Newt, bits of them would have dropped off. This is because, apart from Newt and Shadwell, they'd been dead for quite some time. It was a mistake to think of Shadwell. Newt never found out if he had a first name, as a lone nut. It was just that all the others were dead, in most cases for several hundred years. Once the army had been as big as it currently appeared in Shadwell's creatively edited bookkeeping, Newt had been surprised to find that the Witchfinder army had an antecedents as long and almost as bloody as its more mundane counterpart. The rates of pay for witchfinders had last been set by Oliver Cromwell and never reviewed. Officers got a crown, and the general got a sovereign. It was just an honorarium, of course, because you got 9 pence per witch found, and first pick of their property. You really got to rely on those 9 pences. And so times had been a bit hard before Shadwell had gone on the payrolls of heaven and hell. Newt's pay was 1 old shilling per year. In return for this, he was charged to keep glimmer, firelock, firebox, tinderbox, or igniferous matches about his person at all times, although Shadwell indicated that a Ronson gaslighter would do very well. Shadwell had accepted the invention that the patent cigarette lighter in the same way that the conventional soldiers welcomed the repeating rifle. And the way Newt looked at it, it was like being in one of those organizations, like Sealed Knot, or those people who kept on refighting the American Civil War. It got you out at weekends and meant that you were keeping alive final traditions that had made Western civilization what it was today. An hour after leaving the headquarters, Newt pulled into a levee and rummaged in the box on the passenger seat. And then he opened the door window using a pair of pliers for the purpose, since the handle had long since fallen off. The packet of firelighters was sent winging over a hedge. A moment later, the thumb screw followed it. He debated about the rest of the stuff and then put it back in the box. The pin was Witchfinder military issue, with a good ebony knob on the end like a lady's hat pin. He knew what it was for. He'd done quite a lot of reading. Shadwell had piled him up with pamphlets at their first meeting, but the army had also accumulated various books and documents which Newt suspected would be worth a fortune if they ever hit the market. The pin was to jab into suspects. If there was a spot on their body where they didn't feel anything, they were a witch. Simple. Some of the fraudulent witchfinders had used special retracting pins, but this one was honest, solid steel. He wouldn't be able to look old Shadwell in the face if he threw away the pin. Besides, it was probably bad luck. He started the engine and resumed his journey. Newt's car was a wasabi. He called it Dick Turpin, in the hope that one day someone would ask him why. It would be a very accurate historian who could pinpoint the precise day when the Japanese changed from being fiendish automatons who copied everything from the West to becoming skilled and cunning engineers who would leave the West standing. But the wasabi had been designed on that one confused day and combined the traditional bad points of most Western cars with a host of innovative disasters, the avoidance of which had made firms like Honda and Toyota what they were today. Newt had never actually seen another one on the road, despite his best efforts. For years, and without much conviction, he'd enthused to his friends about its economy and efficiency in the desperate hope that one of them might buy one, because misery loves company. In vain, he did point out its 823cc engine, its 3-speed gearbox, its incredible safety devices like the balloons which inflated on dangerous occasions, such as when you were doing 45 miles per hour on a straight dry road but were about to crash because a huge safety balloon had just obscured the view. He'd also waxed slightly lyrical about the Korean-made radio, which picked up Radio Pyongyang and incredibly well, and the simulated electronic voice, which warned you about not wearing a seatbelt, even when you were. It had been programmed by someone who not only didn't understand English, but didn't understand Japanese either. It was a state of the art, he said. The art in this case was probably pottery. His friends nodded and agreed and privately decided that if it ever came to buying a wasabi or walking, they'd invest in a pair of shoes. They came to the same thing anyway, since one reason for the wasabi's incredible MPG was the fact that it spent a lot of time waiting in garages while crankshafts and things were in the post from the world's only surviving wasabi agent in the Nigirizushi, Japan. Yes. In that vague Zen-like trance in which most people drive, Newt found himself wondering exactly how you use the pin. Did you say, I've got a pin and I'm not afraid to use it? Have pin, will travel, the pin slinger, the man with the golden pin, the pins of Navarone. It might have interested Newt to know that of the 39,000 women tested with the pin during the centuries of witch hunting, 29,000 said, ouch. 9,999 didn't feel anything because of the use of aforesaid retractable pins, and one witch declared that it had miraculously cleared up the arthritis in her leg. Her name was Agnes Nutter. She was the Witchfinder Army's greatest failure. One of the early entries in the Nice and Accurate Prophecies concerned Agnes Nutter's own death. The English, by and large, being a crass and indolent race, were not as keen on burning people as other countries in Europe. In Germany, the bonfires were built and burned with regular Teutonic thoroughness. Even the pious Scots, locked throughout history in a long drawn-out battle with their arch-enemies, the Scots managed a few burnings to while away the long winter evenings, but the English never seemed to have the heart for it. One reason for this may have to do with the manner of Agnes Nutter's death, which more or less marked the end of the serious witch-hunting craze in England, a howling mob reduced to utter fury by her habit of going around being intelligent and curing people, arrived at her house one April evening to find her sitting with her coat on waiting for them. "You're tardy," she said to them. "I should have been aflame 10 minutes since." Then she got up and hobbled slowly through the suddenly silent crowd of the cottage, or out of the cottage, into the bonfire that had been hastily thrown together on the village green. Legend says that she climbed awkwardly onto the pyre and thrust her arms around the stake behind her. "Tie it well," she said to the astonished witch-finder, and then, as the villagers sidled toward the pyre, she raised her handsome head in the firelight and said, "Gather ye right close, good people. Come close until the fire near scorch ye. For I charge ye that all must see how the last true witch in England dies. For which I am, for so I am judged, yet I know not what my true crime may be. And therefore let mine death be a message to the world. Gather ye right close, and say, and mark well the fate of all who meddle with such as they do not understand." And apparently she smiled and looked up at the sky over the village and added, "That goes for you as well, you old daft old fool." And after that strange blasphemy, she said no more. She let them gag her and stood imperiously as the torches were put to the dry wood. The crowd grew nearer, one or two of its members a little uncertain as to whether they'd done the right thing, now they came to think about it. 30 seconds later, an explosion took out the village green. scythed the valley clean of every living thing, and was seen as far away as Halifax. There was much subsequent debate as to whether this had been sent by God or by Satan, but a note later found in Agnes Netter's cottage indicated that any divine or devilish intervention had been materially helped by the contents of Agnes's petticoats, wherein she had, with some foresight, concealed 80 pounds of gunpowder and 40 pounds of roofing nails. What Agnes also left behind on the kitchen table, beside a note canceling the milk, was a box and a book. There were specific instructions as to what should be done with the box, and equally specific instructions about what should be done with the book. It was to be sent to Agnes's son-in-law, John Device. The people who found it, who were from the next village and had been woken up by the explosion, considered ignoring the instructions and just burning the cottage, and then looked around at the twinkling fires and nail-studded wreckage and decided not to. Besides, Agnes's note included painfully precise predictions about what would happen to people who did not carry out her orders. The man who put the torch to Agnes Nutter was a witchfinder major. They found his hat in a tree 2 miles away. His name, stitched inside on a fairly large piece of tape, was "Thou shalt not commit adultery, Pulsifer," one of England's most assiduous witch-finders, and it might have afforded him some satisfaction to know that his last surviving descendant was now, even if unawares, heading toward Agnes Nutter's last surviving descendant. He might have felt that some ancient revenge was at last going to be discharged. If he'd known what was actually going to happen when that descendant met her, he would have turned in his grave, except that he had never got one. Firstly, however, Newt had to do something about the flying saucer. It landed in the road ahead of him just as he was trying to find the lower Tadfield turning, and had the map spread over the steering wheel. He had to brake hard. It looked like every cartoon of a flying saucer Newt had ever seen. He stared over the top of his map. A door in the saucer slid aside with a satisfying whoosh, revealing a gleaming walkway which extended automatically down to the road. Brilliant blue light shone out, outlining 3 alien shapes. They walked down the ramp. At least 2 of them walked. The one that looked like a pepper pot just skidded down it and fell over at the bottom. The other 2 ignored its frantic beeping and walked over to the car quite slowly, in the worldwide approved manner, policemen already compiling their charge sheet in their heads. The tallest one, a yellow toad dressed in kitchen foil, rapped on Newt's window. He wound it down. The thing was wearing the kind of mirror-finished sunglasses that Newt had always thought of as cool-hand Luke shades. "Morning, sir, or madam, or neuter," the thing said. "This your planet, is it?" The other alien, which was stubby and green, had wandered off into the woods by the side of the road, out of the corner of his eye. Newt saw it kick a tree and then run a leaf through some complicated gadget on its belt. It didn't look very pleased. "Well, yes, I suppose so," he said. The toad stared thoughtfully at the skyline. Had it long, have we, sir?" it said. Not personally. I mean, as a species, about 500,000 years, I think." The alien exchanged glances with its colleague. "Been letting the old acid rain build up, haven't we, sir?" it said. "Been letting ourselves go a bit with the old hydrocarbons, perhaps?" "I'm sorry? Could you tell me your planet's albedo, sir?" said the toad, still staring levelly at the horizon as though it was doing something interesting. No? "Well, I'm sorry to have to tell you, sir, that your polar polar ice caps are below regulation size for a planet of this category, sir. Oh dear, said Newt. He was wondering who he could tell about this, and realizing that there was absolutely no one who would believe him. The toad bent closer. It seemed to be worried about something insofar as Newt was any judge of the expression of an alien race he'd never encountered before. We'll overlook it on this occasion, sir. Newt gabbled. I'll see to it. Well, when I say I mean, I think Antarctica or something belongs to every country or something, and the fact is, sir, that we have been asked to give you a message. Oh, message runs, we give you a message of universal peace and cosmic harmony, and such like. The message ends, said the toad. Oh. Newt turned this over in his mind. Oh, that's very kind. Have you got any idea why we have been asked to bring you this message, sir? Said the toad. Newt brightened. I suppose, he flailed. What with mankind's harnessing of the atom, and neither have we, sir. The toad stood up. One of them phenomena, I expect. Well, we'd better be going. It shook its head vaguely, turned around, and waddled back to the saucer without another word. Newt stuck his head out of the window. Thank you. The small alien walked past the car. CO2 level up 0.5%, it rasped, giving him a meaningful look. You do know you could find yourself charged with being a dominant species while under the influence of impulse-driven consumerism, don't you? The two of them righted the third alien, dragged it back up the ramp, and shut the door. Newt waited a while, in case there were any particular light displays, but it just stood there. Eventually, he drove up on the verge and around it. When he looked in his rearview mirror, it had gone. I must be overdoing something, he thought guiltily, but what? I can't even tell Shadwell because he'd probably bawl me out for not counting their nipples. Anyway, said Adam, you've got it all wrong about witches. The them were sitting on a field gate watching dog rolling in cow pats. The little mongrel seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. I've been reading about them, he said in a slightly louder voice. Actually, they've been right all along, and it's wrong to persecute them with British inquisitions and stuff. My mother said they were just intelligent women protesting in the only way open to them against the stifling injustices of a male-dominated social hierarchy, said Pepper. Pepper's mother lectured at Norton Polytechnic. Yes, but your mother's always saying things like that, said Adam after a while. Pepper nodded amiably. And she said, at worst, they were just free-thinking worshippers of the progenerative principle. Who's the progenerative principle? Said Wensleydale. Dunno, something to do with maples, I think, said Pepper vaguely. Well, I thought they worshipped the devil, said Brian, but without automatic condemnation. The them had an open mind on the whole subject of devil worship. The them had an open mind about everything. Anyway, the devil would be better than a stupid maple. That's where you're wrong, said Adam. It's not the devil. It's another god or something with horns. The devil, said Brian. No, said Adam patiently. People just got him mixed up. He's just got horns, similar. He's called Pan. He's half a goat. Which half? Said Wensleydale. Adam thought about it. The bottom half, he said at length. Fancy you not knowing that. I should have thought everyone knew that. Goats haven't got a bottom half, said Wensleydale. They've got a front half and a back half, just like cows. They watched dogs some more, drumming their heels on the gate. It was too hot to think. Then Pepper said, if he's got goat legs, he shouldn't have horns. They belong to the front half. I didn't make 'em up, did I? Said Adam, aggrieved. I was just telling you. It's news to me. I made 'em up. No need to go on at me. It's news to me. Yeah. Anyway, said Pepper, this stupid Pop can't go around complaining if people think he's a devil, not with having horns on. People are bound to say, oh, here comes the devil. The dog started to dig up a rabbit hole. Adam, who seemed to have a weight on his mind, took a deep breath. You don't have to be so literal about everything, he said. That's the trouble these days, grasping materialism. People like you who go around chopping down rainforests and making holes in the ozone layer. There's a big hole in the ozone layer because of grass materialism, people like you. I can't do anything about it, said Brian automatically. I'm still paying off a stupid cucumber frame. It's in the magazine, said Adam. It takes millions of acres of rainforest to make one beef burger. And all this ozone is leaking away because of, he hesitated, people spraying the environment. And there's whales, said Wensleydale. We've got to save them. Adam looked blank. His plunder of new Aquarian's back issue hadn't included anything about whales. Its editors had assumed that the readers were all for saving whales in the same way that they assumed that those readers breathed and walked upright. There was this program about them, explained Wensleydale. What have we got to save them for? Said Adam. He had confused visions of saving up whales until he had enough for a badge. Wensleydale paused and racked his memory. Because they can sing, and they've got big brains. There's hardly any of them left, and we don't need to kill them anyway, because they only make pet food and stuff. If they're so clever, said Brian slowly, what are they doing in the sea? Oh, I don't know, said Adam, looking thoughtfully. Swimming around all day, just opening their mouths and eating stuff. Sounds pretty clever to me. A squeal of brakes and a long, drawn-out crunch interrupted him. They scrambled off the gate and ran up the lane to the crossroads, where a small car lay on its roof in the end of a long skid mark. A little further down the road was a hole. It looked as though the car had tried to avoid it. As they looked at it, a small, oriental-looking head darted out of the side. Them dragged the door open and pulled the unconscious Newt. Visions of medals for heroic rescue thronged Adam's head. Practical considerations of first aid thronged about that of Wensleydale. We shouldn't move him, he said, because of broken bones. We ought to get someone. Adam cast around. There was a rooftop just visible in the trees down the road. It was Jasmine Cottage. And in Jasmine Cottage, Anathema Device was sitting in front of a table on which some bandages, aspirin, and assorted first aid items had been laid out for the past hour. Anathema had been looking at the clock. He'll be coming around any moment now, she thought, and then, when he got there, he wasn't what she'd been expecting. More precisely, he wasn't what she'd been hoping for. She had been hoping, rather self-consciously, for someone dark and handsome. Newt was tall, but with a rolled-out thin look, and while his hair was undoubtedly dark, it wasn't any sort of fashion accessory. It was just a lot of thin black strands all growing together out of the top of his head. This was not Newt's fault. In his younger years, he would go every couple of months to the barber shop on the corner clutching a photograph he'd carefully torn from a magazine which showed someone with an impressively cool haircut grinning at the camera, and he would show the picture to the barber and ask to be made to look like that, please, and the barber, who knew his job, would take one look and then give Newt the basic all-purpose short back and sides. After a year of this, Newt realized that he obviously didn't have the face that went with haircuts. The best Newt and Pulsifer could hope for after a haircut was shorter hair. It was the same with suits. The clothing hadn't been invented that would make him look suave and sophisticated and comfortable. These days he had learned to be satisfied with anything that would keep the rain off and give him somewhere to keep his change. And he wasn't handsome, not even when he took off his glasses, and she discovered when she took off his shoes to lay him on her bed, he wore odd socks, one blue with a hole in the heel and one gray one with holes around the toes. I suppose I'm meant to feel a wave of warm, tender female something or other about this, she thought. I just wish he'd washed them. So tall, dark, but not handsome, she shrugged. Okay, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. The figure on the bed began to stir, and Anathema, who, in the very nature of things, was always looked to the future, suppressed her disappointment and said, "How are we feeling now?" Newt opened his eyes. He was lying in a bedroom, and it wasn't his. He knew this instantly because of the ceiling. His bedroom ceiling still had the model aircraft hanging from the bits of cotton. He'd never got around to taking them down. The ceiling just had cracked plaster. Newt had never been in a woman's bedroom before, but he sensed that this one, largely by a combination of soft smells, or that this was one, largely by a combination of soft smells. There was a hint of talcum and lily of the valley, and no rank suggestion of old t-shirts that had forgotten what the inside of a tumble dryer looked like. He tried to lift his head up, groaned, and let it sink back onto the pillow. Pink. He couldn't help noticing. "You banged your head on the steering wheel," said the voice that roused him. "Nothing broken, though. What happened?" Newt opened his eyes. "Car all right?" he said. Apparently, a little voice inside it keeps repeating, "Freeze, Frassen, Schleetbert." "See?" said Newt to an invisible audience. "They knew how to build them in those days. That plastic finish hardly takes a dent." He blinked at Anathema. "I swerved to avoid a Tibetan in the road," he said. "At least, I think I did. I think I've probably gone mad." The figure walked around into his line of sight. It had dark hair and red lips and green eyes, and it was almost certainly female. Newt tried not to stare. It said, "If you have, no one's going to notice." Then she smiled. "Do you know, I've never met a witchfinder before." Newt began. She held up his open wallet. "I had to look inside," she said. Newt felt extremely embarrassed. A not unusual state of affairs. Shadwell had given him an official witchfinder's warrant card, which, among other things, charged all beadles, magistrates, bishops, and bailiffs to give him free passage and as much dry kindling as he required. It was incredibly impressive, a masterpiece of calligraphy, and probably quite old. He'd forgotten about it. "It's really just a hobby," he said wretchedly. "I'm really he wasn't going to say wages clerk, not here, not now, not to a girl like this. A computer engineer." He lied. Want to be. In my heart, I'm a computer engineer. It's only the brain that's letting me down." "Excuse me, could I know—" "Anathema device," said Anathema. "I'm an occultist." "That's just a hobby. I'm really a witch." "Well done. You're half an hour late," she said, handing him a small sheet of cardboard. "So you'd better read this. It'll save a lot of time." Newt did, in fact, own a small home computer, despite his boyhood experiences. In fact, he'd owned several. You always knew which ones he owned. They were desktop equivalents of the Wasabi. They were the ones which, for example, dropped to half price just after he'd bought them, or were launched in a blaze of publicity and disappeared into obscurity within a year, or only worked at all if you stuck them in a fridge, or if by some fluke they were basically good machines. Newt always got the few that were sold with the early bug-infested version of the operating system, but he persevered because he believed. Adam also had a small computer. He used it for playing games, but never for very long. He'd load a game, watch it intently for a few minutes, and then proceed to play it until the high score counter ran out of zeros. When the other them wondered about this strange skill, Adam professed mild amazement that everyone didn't play games like this. All you have to do is learn how to play it, and then it's just easy, he said. Quite a lot of the front parlor in Jasmine Cottage was taken up. Newt noticed with a sinking feeling, with piles of newspapers, clippings were stuck around the walls. Some of them had bits circled in red ink. He was mildly gratified to spot several he had cut out for Shadwell. Anathema owned very little in the way of furniture. The only thing she'd bothered to bring with her had been her clock, one of the family heirlooms. It wasn't a full-case grandfather clock, but a wall clock with a free-swinging pendulum that E.A. Poe would cheerfully have strapped someone under. Newt kept finding his eyes drawn to it. It was built by an ancestor of mine, said Anathema, putting the coffee cups down on the table. Sir Joshua Device, you may have heard of him. He invented the little rocking thing that made it possible to build accurate clocks cheaply. They named it after him. The Joshua, said Newt guardedly, the Device. In the last half hour, Newt had heard some pretty unbelievable stuff and was close to believing it, but you have to draw the line somewhere. The other device is named after a real person, or the device is named after a real person. He said, oh yes, fine old Lancashire name. From the French, I believe. You'll be telling me next you've never heard of Sir Humphrey Gadget. Oh, now come on. Who devised a gadget that made it possible to pump flooded mine shafts? Or Peter Gizmo, I'm sorry. It's a weird way of spelling it. It's Peter Gizmo, or Cyrus T. Doodad, America's foremost black inventor. Thomas Edison said that the only other contemporary practical scientists he admired were Cyrus T. Doodad and Ella Reader Widget, and she looked at Newt's blank expression. I did my PhD on them, she said. The people who invented things so simple and universally useful that everyone forgot that they'd ever actually needed to be invented. Sugar? You normally have two, said Anathema sweetly. Newt stared back at the card she'd handed him. She seemed to think it would explain everything. It didn't. It had a ruled line down the middle. On the left-hand side was a short piece of what seemed to be poetry in black ink. On the right-hand side, in red ink this time, were comments and annotations. The effect was as followed. So, left side first. 3819. When Orient's chariot inverted be, four wheels in the sky, a man with bruises be upon your bed, aching his head for willow fine, and man who testeth with a pine, yet his heart be clean, yet seed of mine own undoing. Take the means of flame from him, for to make right certain, together ye shall be until the end that is to come. Right side. Japanese car upturned, car smashed, not serious injury. Take in Willowfine aspirin, CF 3757. Pin equals Witchfinder, CF 102. Good Witchfinder refers to Pulsifer, CF 002, search for matches, etc. in the 1990s. Less than a day. CF 712, 3803, 4004. Newt's hand went automatically to his pocket, his cigarette lighter gone. What's this mean? He said hoarsely. Have you ever heard of Agnes Nutter? Said Anathema. No, said Newt, taking a desperate defense in sarcasm. You're going to tell me that she invented mad people, I suppose. Another fine old Lancashire name, said Anathema coldly. If you don't believe, read up on the witch trials of the early 17th century. She was an ancestress of mine. As a matter of fact, one of your ancestors burned her alive, or tried to. Newt listened in fascinated horror to the story of Agnes Nutter's death. Thou shalt not commit adultery, Pulsifer, he said when she'd finished. That sort of name was quite common in those days, said Anathema. Apparently there were 10 children, and they were a very religious family. There was a covetousness, Pulsifer, false witness, Pulsifer. I think I understand, said Newt. Gosh, I thought Shadwell said he'd heard the name before. It must be in the army records. I suppose if I'd gone around being called adultery Pulsifer, I'd want to hurt as many people as possible. I think he just didn't like women he just didn't like women very much. Thanks for taking it so well, said Newt. I mean, he must have been an ancestor. There aren't many Pulsifers. Maybe that's why I sort of met up with the Witchfinder army. Could be fate, he said hopefully. Alright, and this is where I'm going to end it for tonight. We will be back for more. Your boy's a bit sleepy now. But yes, namaste. I love you guys, and I will see you on the next one.